Hey, this is John. Today I just want to talk a little bit about what Marxism actually is today, given especially that the not like recent video, but relatively recent video I made on socialism was I think kind of like with mixed reception. I think part of the problem is that this is one of the least well understood topics on the internet for I don't know if I had to guess, probably the last 20 years, but maybe not. So, in general, the issue is that nobody really knows what they're talking about. Now, there is actually a very simple solution to all this, which is, and I don't mean to be a gatekeeper, but if you just like read on the topic, then you will have a pretty good idea of what it's actually about. Now, in particular, though, I do want to highlight the actual legitimate problems with Marxism, rather than the sort of what I would call airy critiques of it that have been floating around, right? Um, Now, okay, yeah, so let's just make that the introduction. I will say as well that I'm also going to be basically scaffolding and using Peter Singer's A Very Short Introduction to Marx as the sort of outline for the direction of the video, right? And the reason I chose that book is because I think it's very accessible and to the point. And Peter Singer is a very good philosopher with lots of insightful things to say. Okay. Now, by the way, so like always, I'm just going to quickly recommend a book every week, or at least let you guys know what I'm reading to help with the literacy crisis and generate interest around reading. So this week I'll be reading Lieutenant Gustel, or Lieutenant Gustel in English. There's not a lot to say about it. It's basically a very it's a short story, right? It's not even quite a novella, and it's pretty much commentary on like hollow codes of honor and like institutions related to the military. One thing I will say, and although I don't want to make the entire video about linguistics and translations, this work in particular, so I mean, our Arthur Schnitzel is a fantastic writer, and I've read some of his other work, but from my understanding, this work in particular, the translation, because it uses so many Austrian colloquialisms in the original German, it's actually not very clear in the translation. And maybe one other tip too, just to add, if you do end up reading it, again, it's very short. You should try to contextualize the anti-Semitic remarks in the context of him. His father, for example, is a Jewish doctor, right? So just maybe just keep that in mind. Okay. So, anyways, now, talking a little bit about Marxism, the issue, I think the biggest problem is that everyone who comments on it is either a philosopher who doesn't understand economics or an economist who's not really interested in philosophy. And so, for example, I had recently heard some, big shot economist here on YouTube calling Marx sort of culminating work, Das Kapital, which is kind of funny, but at the same time, you got to know that the guy obviously didn't read it. And how do I know that? Well, I know that because he recommended Mises as sort of the leading critique of Marxism. And as you know, if you watched the last video, I critiqued the Mises for not understanding Marxism. So if either of the two had actually read Das Kapital, then they would know that, but they haven't. So, anyways, um, I will also add that a lot of people who have critiqued Marxism unknowingly and perhaps unwillingly kind of invoke a lot of the concepts. And so, for example, the main issue, and if you want to take this as a summary of the video, basically the main issue is with the labor theory of value as being economically reductionist. The idea that you're going to ascribe all of the value of labor to, or all the value of economic goods just to the labor inputs is, obviously erroneous in the perspective of modern economics, because, for example, some of the other things that, I would even call potentially relatively arbitrary forces that affect it, like demand, do affect the value of the goods in the market, right? And can add surplus value distinct from labor. But anyways, a lot of people, for example, will use the words like, just work harder, for example, if you're not a successful person. And that's really interesting. Or, if they want to attribute to themselves the successes that they've had, and they view that as a result of hard work, this is implicitly invoking the labor theory of value, which is, one, incorrect, but two, you hate Marx so much, but you agree with him that the value that you've produced is a product of your labor alone, and that's just not true. So anyways, that's kind of a funny thing. A lot of people contradict themselves and their implicit positions that way. So step one, do understand what you were talking about. And I don't think it should be a surprise, one, that nobody really understands, and two, that everyone's getting it wrong, because the idea in the space has been to take this like 3,000 page tome of political, philosophical, political economics, basically, and reduce it to is really bad or is really good, and all the details. I don't have a good analogy for that. So yeah, like I mentioned, I am scaffolding off of Peter Singer's book. One thing to kind of note, and I'll bring this up later as well, is that the book was initially published in 1980. So I will be, contextual. That's important context for later, and you'll see what I mean. But basically, Marx's theory had developed from Hegel's phenomenology of mind, and basically Hegel had this idea, and technically too, I guess it's like Phenomenologie der Geist, which Geist is sort of ambiguously German for either mind or spirit, but mind, I think, makes the most sense in the context of Hegel, but it's just something else to keep in mind. The idea is that you interpret history as a result of trying to close a gap between you and sort of this societal mind, and why is because you place, there's sort of this higher thing above you that you are disconnected from, and so you feel alienated from that thing, and so you try to close the gap over time, because that alienation makes you feel devalued in some respects. So that's pretty much the summary of that. Now, what Marx does is he says, okay, well, basically Hegel is a little bit too airy, and I do kind of think that Marx is still kind of getting a little bit too far here, but I do also kind of have a lot of agreements with him on this. The idea of Marx is take the idea of Hegel, but then say, okay, we're going to apply that to the products of labor instead of, this idea of mind, right? We're not interpreting mind or spirit. We're just interpreting economic factors. And so what does that mean? Well, if we, for example, want to, we produce products with our labor, and we have, some attachment to those products, we, impart ourselves onto that product. And when, or, his idea is that there's the bourgeoisie class that separates us from the products of our labor, and then we feel alienated, right? And so Marx is basically saying, well, we are trying to close that gap between us and the products of our labor over time. And that is how history gets interpreted in Marx's view. Marx's idea is that eventually, and it's sort of interesting, I guess, to say that he doesn't necessarily advocate for a particular type of political organization, but it's strongly suggested that he, would support communism, not as meant by the Soviet Union, but in the more pre-Soviet sense, which is also important, as I noted in the other video. So, but again, the idea is that over time, history is eventually going to converge, he says, to closing the gap between us and the products of our labor. Right now, I did mention surplus value is sort of the most notable concept. The labor theory of value, as I've noted, is obviously the main issue with the whole theory, or I would say is characteristic of the main issues, which is the economic reductionism. It simplifies too much. And yeah, okay. I think, one important point as well is that, so Marx was probably right in a lot of the predictions that, for example, Peter Singer suggests that Marx was wrong in a lot of his predictions, but that is only in the context of that being written in the 1980s, whereas in the 1960s, we sort of had the introduction of neoliberalism to North America and the globe. And from that, a lot of those things like, say, the interaction of supply and demand with the labor market and his predictions there ended up coming true in the sort of more recent time. And that's not to say that Marx had necessarily gotten there by the correct method, but I also don't think it takes that much thinking to get us to those being the consequences if we are specifically dealing with the sort of uncontested libertarian capitalism of the neoliberal era. And that's important to mention because although Marx and all of the sort of critiques of Marx in particular contextualize him as, or declare that he is attacking capitalism, it's really more the case that he's attacking the uncontested libertarian capitalism, which leading up to the 1960s wasn't necessarily in place. So what you see with things like, for example, the wealth gap, right? When Peter Singer was writing this, the wealth gap had largely been closed, and sort of not like closed, but it was getting smaller over time, right? That was a trend. The problem with the neoliberal era is basically you move from the Keynes' influence to Milton Friedman's approach, which, from my understanding, pretty much seems like a bastardized Adam Smith. Whereas I would say that Adam Smith had sort of argued for bounded greed. Milton Friedman had made an argument about free markets. And I think that, to some extent, that's fine. So, for example, economists are largely in agreement that international free trade is best, despite the recent, well, but within your own economy, right? The way that Adam Smith has sort of been, bastardized has been to say that he's, arguing effectively for unbounded greed, or that, greed is best. And my contention is basically, well, that doesn't make any sense. And that has obviously been proven in modern time, but on one hand, we can say, as Peter Singer points out in this book, right? He gives the example that of if everyone takes a bus route. Let me back up for a second. Individual freedoms can, when exercised by everyone, affect society in a bad way. So, for example, if everyone has the option of taking a bus route, but everyone decides, for example, to take their car because maybe as an individual that will be faster, you want to have wait lines, etc. Well, you can end up with a lot of traffic and excess pollution, and all of a sudden for everyone it's bad if everyone decides to exercise that. So, just from that sort of simple example, you can say, okay, well, obviously greed is, it doesn't really make sense, and we do need like some kind of check on people's individual freedoms. And I've mentioned this as well in another video talking about Kant and John Stuart Mill and the conception of deontology and utilitarianism, right? As, again, arguing for also bounded freedoms, like, I don't know, maybe that's the takeaway. Everything is just like reasonable. It's not just, we're all at this like dumbass party. We just do what we want. Well, another example of this, though, in the more recent time is, oh God, I hope nobody hates me for it, but so suppose that many people don't want to get a vaccine against the accurate viewpoint of immunologists and virologists. Well, obviously, in the most sort of extreme cases, that can overburden the medical system, right? Which would be bad for everyone. And I would also note that then that does also infringe on the health and safety of people who did not consent, or not like consent to being this part of the society that's dysfunctional and operates as though as every individual can operate independently of their society. Okay. All right. Now, obviously, then it's hard to justify selfishness even from a selfish perspective if that can result in societal issues that then affect you. So really, when you act selfish, you're basically relying on everyone else not acting selfish for you to function, to gain the benefit of that, basically. So now, even aside from that, and I think I'm going to probably talk about Adam Smith in more detail later. One of these sort of other sort of more, I don't know if you think about it like from a more philosophical perspective, I guess, what is the idea of greed, and why does Adam Smith even argue that, greed is a good thing in the first place? Well, you kind of think of it as like, all right, I go to another country, I bring back a bunch of gold to my country, and now my country has more, gold, has more resources to work with. Everyone's eating off of a larger plate. The problem is that, I am under the sort of, ideology of being greedy, going to try to extract value from the people who are also benefiting from the gold, so to speak. And what does that mean? Well, it means that I'm going to one hoard and to try to, take as much as I can from them as well. Now, I'm going to break that down more in another video, but, basically you can look at it as like three different cases. Either everyone's greedy, a single person is greedy, and some people are greedy. And my point is basically that none of those situations are beneficial to anyone but the greedy. So no, it's not a good argument. That's a terrible argument for running your society, but I'll prove that later. Okay, so there's research on that too. Like, you don't have to just listen to me. What are some of the other predictions that Peter Singer brings up that he says basically didn't come to fruition that I kind of disagree with now? Okay, so again, contextualizing this, Peter Singer wrote this book at a time where there were better regulations against monopolistic businesses and collusion, for example. Okay. Which we say now is ipso facto something that does occur in the market. There are monopolistic businesses, and we almost kind of celebrate them, right? And so when you think about, okay, well, like, what's the most obvious example? Well, you could take, Google, for example, or, and also, too, one thing that you have to realize that Google is not the only company that Google owns. It also owns other companies, like YouTube, for example. And so again, like, where are you going to go for another search engine? And also with them literally, I believe they're either in a lawsuit, or they were in the process of getting a lawsuit for collusion regarding YouTube with the smartphone companies. And then another sort of very obvious example is Meta, right? They own, basically all of the social media platforms. So again, like, where are you really going to go to, for example, advertise, right? Which is, by the way, their main business. I mean, yeah, it's collecting your data, but their main business is advertising to you, in case you didn't know that, but I think that's kind of obvious. Okay. Now, I mean, on a side note, because some people don't think that monopolies are bad. I think it's pretty, like, basic to say that, like, if suppose you had a pie with 10 slices, and then one person takes 7. Well, one, you only have 3 slices left, but what if you had to divide that with, like, I don't know, 10 other people? Yeah, obviously bad. Okay. It's not as much pie left for everyone. Okay. Oh. So, okay, so I guess I didn't actually write down the predictions. I'll give you one, though, right? So, for example, there was the wealth gap. I'll mention another, though, which is that the Marx had argued that there was going to be a sort of, like, reserve army for employment. And what that means is that there's, like, some percentage of people that are, remaining unemployed. Now, I had lightly made this observation, I guess, a few months ago, because I wasn't sure myself, but it really kind of seems like from the data that this is kind of the thing that's going on. And for example, one of the things that happens with degrees for the sake of business, just to make this a more concrete point, is that I'm more or less pretty confident saying that the way that our universities function is such that we try to get out as many degrees as possible by, one, I would say lowering the standard for those degrees, academically, of course, not by any other means. And I don't, by the way, I don't care about fancy schools. I don't think that's what I mean by standards. If you went to a fancy school, though, that's good for you. But the idea is that by lowering the standards, we can get more people into the market. And then even if businesses did, say, want competitive talent, they can now get that at a lower price. And how maybe would I say that I kind of come to that conclusion? Well, I mean, if we look at the sort of employment situation with graduates, that's basically what we see, and it's only getting worse over time, right? Most of them do not get employed in their field. And so, for example, I've been in some, more recent conversations about the situation with the youth and its employment situation. And one of, as I mentioned, right, there's sort of this contradictual employment of the labor theory of value, which is wrong anyways. But there's also the lack of recognition that, one, the unemployment rate here in Canada, for example, for youths 18 to 24 is just shy of 15% right now. That also needs to be contextualized. Well, you also need to consider that there is also an underemployment rate that apparently I could not find more recently, though when I had initially found it, I had believed it was about 60% of those people were underemployed, though I could not find that in recent times. So I just want to make that clear. Maybe it got removed. Maybe I'm wrong. Then you also need to consider that the labor participation rate is only a little bit above 50%. I think it's about 55%. So when you actually consider all of that, you come to the conclusion that only around something like 8 to 10% of youth have suitable work. So then, why all the degrees? I don't really understand. Um, yeah, I think it's pretty clear, right? Universities rip people off, and then those people get funneled into the market as economic fodder. Ooh. Don't shoot me. Okay, so yeah, now, okay, so another sort of like what mainly side of the issue apparently with Marxism has been human nature. I think that's a larger debate though, and I think the idea that we're simply going to say that human beings are greedy is probably too simplistic. Though I generally would agree that Marx probably overestimates human nature, though I wouldn't necessarily say it's directly a consequence of greed that some of these systems have broken down. I would say it's probably a mixture of sparse greed mixed with complacency. Yeah. Okay. But I might make a larger video on that topic specifically if that's of interest. Okay. It's also probably worth mentioning as well that there is a lot of literature. So, when I say like, oh, it's not just a simple matter of saying, oh, well, humans are greedy. Like, uh, for example, that's kind of what Adam Smith was alluding to. And I think he's got a good quote on that. Basically saying that the reason we want for things is not for the ease of life or for the pleasure, but for the vanity. And I think that's kind of an interesting quote, but he's probably wrong about that in aggregate. There's a lot of literature on that topic, is what I'm trying to say, though. It's not that simple. Yeah. So, for example, on the topic of markets creating continually new needs, one source you can be referred to is Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man, which is somewhat contentious, but that's one interesting source that you can be referred to. There's also Roger Scruton, who has also commented on human nature, though he's sort of less economically critical, more like strictly on the topic of human nature, if you will. Yeah. Whereas, what I'm trying to say about Herbert Marcuse is that he's, also contextualizing all of this in the economic perspective. Okay. So again, it's pretty much the end of the video, but the main takeaway is basically that the only real thing that you can criticize, well, I guess I shouldn't say the only real thing, but the main thing that you can criticize Marx for isn't necessarily human nature, it's for economic reductionism. And so probably a more realistic take on that is the evolution from Marxism to Keynesian economics, where Keynes is basically taking an approach that's like free markets with regulations. So there is government intervention, and unsurprisingly, it's sort of an actual middle ground on the issue. Is that supposed to be what works? I don't know. Okay. It's also, I'll also add too that a lot of the issues, anyways, that people bring up about socialism can be applied right back to the sort of uncontested libertarian capitalism. So, for example, people complained about things like potential concentration issues. Like, I don't know how you're supposed to argue that that doesn't occur in a Ayn Randian, uh, whatever, like, she would call herself, but the libertarian capitalist systems. I don't really know how you're supposed to effectively argue that that doesn't occur in those systems, right? So, yeah. Um, I do, on a very last note, I'm just going to mention that I think a lot of the hatred from the media, the people on this particular issue comes from a basically propaganda that's kind of obvious. So and also too, not really understanding the systems or their beliefs. But one of the things that I've said recently is that a lot of people have referenced government bureaucracy as being like 1984, right? And that the idea of socialism is like 1984, and so on, right? But I think those same people, and I'm probably right in saying this, would probably have a very different view if they had grown up on something like Neuromancer instead of 1984, provided they actually read either of those. With the point, again, being that those same criticisms can be applied to the other extreme. They just occur in a bit of a different way, but the result is the same on the extreme end. So you do have to kind of occupy a bit of a middle ground. And so I think that the most effective economic policy probably comes from Keynes, at least from the perspective of economics that actually like benefits the average citizen. Because I do understand, obviously, that the economy has boomed since the free markets, but the economy's been also sort of independent of the welfare of the nation. So, anyways, I think that'll wrap up the video. I hope that was enjoyable. Bye.